On Fanalysis, we're using advanced metrics to identify the players who will help you the most. This is our Fantasy Baseball special, and we welcome in the author of the Fantasy Baseball Black Book, Joe Pisapia. Joe, your unique measurement tool has helped you correctly find players that have been able to make the leap from mediocre to good to becoming elite. I mean, guys like Tatis and Acuna have been guys that kind of fit into that category in years past. So let's talk about some of those mid-range kind of gems that you might like this year. Clearly, a lot of those guys would be on the younger side. But is there any room for a 41-year-old Nelson Cruz as a mid-range guy to make that leap?
On all of my teams, there's always room for Nelson Cruz, Steve, let me tell you. And here's why. It's because he keeps himself in phenomenal shape. There is no deep metric you can look at that shows him slowing down at any time. And yes, it's funny because the things that you find when you get into the mid-rounds, you find older players who maybe are undervalued. You find young players who maybe are post-hype as well, and that's another thing, too, where, you know, no one has any patience anymore for a player to come up and develop. Everybody wants, you know, everyone to be Tatis and Juan Soto right away, and that doesn't always happen. Sometimes it takes a little bit longer. Look at the path of, say, Vladimir Guerrero Jr., right? We forget he's still just, what, 23 years old this year? So, I mean, the guy is so young, and just because he hasn't become the superstar yet, it doesn't mean it can't happen this season. So there are guys that you can find this year, and there's some names, obviously, if you go out there. Nelson Cruz is a guy that's being undervalued. I talked about those utility guys get undervalued because people don't want to, quote, put themselves and lock themselves into a spot. Well, should you? Yes. You should lock yourself into a great utility bat. Why not? Jordan Alvarez fits that. Sure, he's a little risky. JD Martinez is kind of like the middle ground between the two of them. I think any of those three guys is a way to make up offense if you're lacking. And yes, a little bit of a roll of the dice. And yes, you're going to lock in your utility, but that's not a bad thing. Then if you're looking for some speed later on, there's some guys out there in the outfield. Byron Buxton has looked very good this spring. And I know what people are going to say, oh, no, not again with Byron Buxton. Well, he's still south of 30. He is still a young player who's still figuring things out. And this is a player that does have the upside for a 20 home run season and maybe 30 stolen bases at a minimum. And I say at a minimum because this is also a player that I think is growing into his frame. If you look at him physically, you know, we talk about this a lot in football, the guys growing into their frame, but you don't talk about it enough in baseball. And he has put on some weight year over year. And he does have a very, I would say, aggressive style of play. And that's why he's had some of these injuries in the past. So a little bit more balance at the plate. He has shown that this year. That's been very positive. Ramon Laureano is a player people were loving last year as like a fifth-round pick. Now he is going all the way around 143 overall. That's a huge value for a player who's going to give you average, a little power, a little speed, going to play every day.
And I like this guy. I like Laureano. I mean, okay, the A's outfielder doesn't excel in any one of those categories. So if someone doesn't excel in any one category, what makes you believe they're going to be some sort of a breakout candidate?
Well, it's less of a breakout candidate, more as a value, because, you know, not every pick is going to be the sexy, incredible guy that's going to change your roster. What you need sometimes are some good hands as well. You need some folks who are going to go out there and do everything well. Maybe he doesn't do everything great. Maybe he's not going to hit over 300, but he'll hit 280. Maybe he's not going to hit 20 home runs, but he'll hit 15. He's not going to steal 30, but maybe he'll steal 15. And I think those kind of guys, when you could get them at a value that's, you know, in the 150 range of ADP, where the average draft position is for Laureano right now, that is a huge value, and also where he hits in the order potentially. And let's not take too much of what we saw in 2020 to be the end-all be-all, because all it was a very large, small sample size. And I know that's kind of an oxymoron, but that's exactly it. And I think if we start overrating the good or the bad that we saw, it's something to really be, you know, afraid of. And the other guy, too, that I think is very good on the hitting side of the gems in the middle, I think, is Ian Happ, who's going to hit at the top of the Cubs order, offer some power. He's going to play every day. You're looking for at-bats in those middle rounds. You're looking for job security. You're looking for upside, talent, all of the above. And these are some guys that offer all of that.
Okay, you brought up two guys who I feel like, as fantasy baseball players, fantasy baseball owners, I should say, we're tired of hearing about Byron Buxton is going to turn it, it's going to happen for him, or Ian Happ, it's going to happen for him. Do you think that the fact that we're tired of hearing those names gives them even more value because they're falling deeper in the draft?
It absolutely does. You have to look at the age. You have to look at where most players hit their prime in the age 29 to 31 seasons. That's where you're getting the best out of a Major League Baseball player typically. You know, some of these guys haven't even scratched that. I mean, Byron Buxton's still very young, and yes, there is frustration there, but if you're looking for a guy to make up a deficit in a category, the safest category that he gives you is stolen bases. So as long as he is on, he is a threat to steal. It's just a matter of him staying healthy. So in a season-long roto format, Byron Buxton, although risky, is a player you can invest in. Now, a little tougher in head-to-head formats where every week you got to put out a different lineup and you got to win weeks and things like that. That becomes a little trickier. But in that season-long format, guys who have some warts like this, it's okay to take a risk on, because at the end of the day, if they play 120 games and still steal you 25 bags, that's good enough for the investment you have to make on them.
Okay, so what would be considered too much of a risk for somebody like Ian Happ, who's ADP? And by the way, we get so focused on ADP that we almost feel like if you draft a guy 4 picks before he's supposed to be picked, he's got an ADP of 153, but all of a sudden you draft him at 148, you're reaching. How big of a step would you take to go and get somebody like an Ian Happ? How early would you have to go? Would be too much.
Look, ADP is a guideline, and I actually just mentioned this on a show of mine today, Fantasy Pros. ADP is not the end-all, be-all. It's a guideline. If you love a player, you think a player can give you a positive influence on your team, it's okay to go a round or even 2 rounds early on them if you really do believe in the homework that you've done. And the same thing on the pitching side, too. I think there's pitchers who are being grossly undervalued. You look at Chris Paddock, who came off a down year after a brilliant rookie season, right? He's working in that 3rd pitch right now. It looks very good in spring. Be aggressive. This is a guy people loved as an ace. Now he's an afterthought? That's crazy. Charlie Morton has a great track record of the last few years of being excellent. That stop and start last year kind of hurt him. He got off his routine. Pitchers are creatures of habit. Now he's back in the National League. He's back in Atlanta. He's had great strikeout stuff. He looked terrific in the World Series and in the playoffs last year. I would go around early on Charlie Morton every single draft, and I have so far this year. Patrick Corbin, another guy. The stop and start was really tough for some pitchers, especially some veterans, because they got off their routine. Corbin, Charlie Morton, Paddock are all guys that would reinvest in this year off of questionable seasons. And even a pitcher like Jesus Luzardo, I think, might be ready to make that next jump into that elite tier.
Even Corbin, a guy whose pitch speed has dropped dramatically, he was averaging 89.9 miles an hour last year as his fastball. So to have someone who's seen such velocity drop off of his fastball, you still think there's value with a guy like Corbin?
I do, because the velocity so far has been pretty good this season. And, the dip in velocity is something to be concerned with. And this is why spring training doesn't mean a whole lot except for a few guys. There's certain players this offseason or in this that really needed to kind of reassert themselves, as it were. I think Patrick Corbin, certainly one of those guys. Look at Madison Bumgarner so far. Been absolutely dominant so far in spring training, and not with the same velocity he used to have. He used to be at 95. Now, last year he was at 89. Now he's back up to 91. But he's also recognizing that he knows how to get people out now at a lesser velocity, which is something that the great pitchers will do. He's only 31 years old. Sabathia did this. Pedro Martinez did this. The great pitchers, when the velocity declines, they find ways to pitch again into their wheelhouse. And I think when you look at a player like Bumgarner, who is basically free, this is a Hall of Fame pitcher who you can get for free. If you're wrong, you cut him. If you're right, what an incredible reward that is for the risk in your fantasy league.
Well, the reward is you look really smart. I mean, that's why we're doing this. We all want to look like we're smart and knowing baseball, and that's why we lean on you for the guys that have good upside. Everybody loves finding the sleeper list. So I see this list of sleepers you have here, and I'm impressed by a lot of these guys. So which sleepers do you think are ready to take that big leap forward?
Well, first off, Trey Mancini's being grossly undervalued. His ADP started around 200. It's already moved to the 160s. Now he's at spring training. He dealt with cancer last year. But 2 years ago, this was a player with 30 home runs and basically 100 runs, 100 RBI upside. You got to be aggressive on him. Plus, he plays 2 positions. Victor Robles, just 24 years old. They want him to hit at the top of the order. They've made that clear. He's been up there in the spring. Power-speed combination. No, he's not Juan Soto, but he was still a very highly thought-of prospect Let's not go crazy about the small sample of 2020. Let's reinvest on the cheap and get some stolen bases there. Frankie Montas dealt with back issues last year. He had a suspension 2 years ago. But if you look at the last start, he was healthy. He looked great. He's looked good this spring. You're looking for cheap steals later on. Andres Jimenez is a shortstop for Cleveland.
Wait a minute now. Francisco Lindor's not the shortstop at Cleveland anymore. You realize just grabbing shortstop at Cleveland doesn't mean it's going to be a breakout season. What do you like about this former Met?
Well, what I like about him is the cost, first and foremost. And I've seen him play in the minor leagues quite a bit, too. And this is a player that offers you, he's got that X-factor thing where he runs everything out. He's got good range at shortstop. He's a better defender than Ahmed Rosario, who also came over in that deal. And you could see Rosario, they're playing around with him in the outfield. So far, does not look like a great idea. But Jimenez clearly is the guy that they've targeted. He's a better defender, hits good pitching. And that's something Ahmed Rosario can't say. Either of those two things are an asset of his. So for my money, I think Jimenez is another free guy you can draft as a middle infield spot and get a guy who's going to make some good contact, play every day probably, and has stolen base upside. And then you look at another player who actually had COVID last year, Eduardo Rodriguez, who in 2019 had 200 strikeouts, 200 innings pitched, back-to-back years with a 3.8 ERA in the American League East. That's not easy. And now everyone's afraid of him because, well, he had some complications last year from COVID. But he looks healthy now, so why not go after him? And again, everybody's looking for cheap saves. So if you're looking for some cheap saves, I would look in Cincinnati for Amir Garrett. I think he's going to run away with that job in the spring. Doolittle's been terrible in the spring. Lucas Sims is starting the year with an injury. Amir Garrett has the closer mentality. They moved Iglesias this offseason to the Los Angeles Angels. So it looks like they've opened up that path for Amir Garrett. And I think he's exactly the right kind of mentality who could succeed in that role. And everybody wants cheap saves because saves, we all know, turn over quite a bit in bullpens.
Listen, exactly. If you draft closers too early and they don't pan out, man, it'll make you pull your hair out. So don't be drafting closers too early.
How do you think I got like this, Steve?
I didn't want to lead you to it, but it's way too many closers, way too early. So I love the fact that you can find some sleepers at the closer spot. All right, that's a look at some of his mid-tier gyms and ready for breakout sleepers that deserve a spot on your team. Make sure you check out our other segment on draft strategy. For Joe Pisapia of the Fantasy Baseball Black Book, I'm Steve Overmyer. This is Fanalysis.